Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I can see that folks are still joining us. I want to thank you for joining us today for Equity Matters: Why Attacks on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, or DEIA, are a threat to multiracial democracy. My name is Wendy Chun-Hoon. I serve as the President and Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, and I'm very honored to be with you today. Equity Matters is not just a webinar. First and foremost, it is a space for us to come together at what is a very critical moment for our country. Today, we'll explore how attacks on DEIA are not only targeting specific communities, but are also striking at the very heart of our democracy. Together, we'll hear from leaders across sectors who are working every day to defend equity and to build the conditions for multiracial democracy that truly serve us all. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to talk about how we're going to use the chat during today's session. We see the chat as part of building community together. It's a space where you all can reflect and affirm and connect with others who care about the issues that we'll be discussing today. I want to offer a few quick guidelines so that the space works well for everyone. Please use the chat to share reflections, words of encouragement, and insights as the discussion unfolds. We want this to remain a respectful and welcoming space for all participants, so we ask that comments reflect that spirit. And really importantly, if you have questions for the speakers, we ask that you use the Q&A box instead of the chat. And that way we can be sure that your question is seen and lifted up. To get us started, we'd love to know who's in the room with us. I know on my end, a few minutes ago, there was our first poll popped up on the screen. So I just want to encourage everyone to take a moment to respond, and we'll do that now, and then we'll see who's in the room with us. I also see folks checking in the chat. That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Take a few more seconds and respond to the poll. Okay. I'll take cues from my team, but I think maybe we can close the poll now. Hopefully, we've gotten a good feedback. Wow. Yep, that's kind of what we expected. So if you're looking at it on your screen as well, thank you so much for participating. The results are clearly giving us a snapshot of the incredible diversity that's represented with us today. It's a microcosm of the cross-sector leadership and collaboration that we all know is going to be needed to achieve equity and justice in our society. This diversity is absolutely our strength. We need to say it time and again. It reflects the richness of our democracy, and it also reminds us why conversations like the one we're having today are so urgent, because the very values of equity and inclusion are under a coordinated attack. To ground us as we begin this conversation, it's my honor to share some recorded remarks from Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman, who has truly been a steadfast champion for equity and multiracial democracy.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you, class, for creating this space and for bringing us together. We're living through a coordinated effort to roll back diversity, equity and inclusion, and accessibility policies across the country. Republicans are doing all that they can to undermine multicultural democracy so they can limit who has access to opportunity in this country. Trump and his administration have already reversed decades of progress towards equity for the working class. Federal agencies have rescinded executive orders requiring equity assessments across the programs. Offices dedicated to diversity and inclusion are being defunded and dismantled. At the Internal Revenue Service, 20,000 employees have been laid off, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has been essentially shuttered. Without oversight, algorithm biases will go unchecked, widening racial wealth gaps and undermining access to tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. These decisions directly affect families, communities, and economic opportunity for all. And while the most vulnerable among us will carry the heaviest burden of these exclusionary tactics, the elimination of economic opportunity for the working class, well, that impacts all of us. DEIA policies are meant to give everyone their best shot at achieving the American dream and to protect us from all discriminatory tactics in the workplace. They are rooted in landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the decades of work to create equal access to education, to jobs, to healthcare, and civic participation. It is a framework that we use to repair harm and to ensure equal protection for everyone. If we allow this framework to be dismantled, we surrender the only tools we have to address inequities, and more unequal democracies are weaker democracies. In fact, they're not democracies. Therefore, this is not merely a fight for inclusion, it is a fight for democracy itself. What we do now will decide who has a right to be heard and who is left out of the promise of everything America has to offer. So I want to thank you all. Thank you for continuing to sound the alarm and for all of the work that you do. May God bless you and give you strength and the ability to carry on.
Powerful words indeed. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, for helping us understand the urgency of the moment. That was a call to action if I've ever heard one. We will not stand by and let our democracy be dismantled. As Representative Watson-Coleman stated, we're here today because the very nature of our multiracial democracy itself is being threatened. A democracy where people of all races, and ethnicities have equal voice, equal rights, and real access to participate and self-govern, and where institutions are actively removing barriers to that participation, actively removing barriers. We do know a part of what is driving this backlash. Census data shows that by the 2040, white Americans will no longer be the largest racial group. And for some, this shift is frightening. Rather than embracing it as an opportunity for inclusion, too many leaders have chosen to weaponize fear. Their tactics, which we are experiencing as attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and on our democracy, are considered by many to be authoritarian in nature. They're being designed to weaken civil rights infrastructure, pit communities against each other, and strip away the very protections that make democracy real and accessible for all of us. The consequences of their efforts are dangerous: an erosion of trust, growing inequality, policies that criminalize differences instead of celebrating our diversity. And this is exactly why today's conversation is so important. Our speakers represent many different sectors. You all represent many different sectors across our movement, from education, health, labor, immigration, civil rights, and more. And together, our speakers also reflect the very diversity necessary to push back, to inoculate against what we should expect to see in copycat legislation, and to advance real solutions. I think we all know the stakes could not be higher, and so if we do not act now, these so-called authoritarian strategies are going to continue to undermine our democracy. But here's the call to action. If we move together, courageously, strategically, unapologetically, we can defend and expand a multiracial democracy where every person has dignity, voice, and opportunity. So with that, I'd like to finally start to introduce our amazing speakers today. I'll do that in just a second. The basic format for our conversation is I'll invite each of the speakers to introduce themselves. I'll pose a common question and take a couple of minutes each to answer it. And then we're going to start to get into a deeper conversation. Throughout this conversation, and sort of as a way to make sure that we're engaging all of you who are tuning in, we're going to keep doing some of these polls and just get a pulse of what the feeling is among the group. And then we'll start to close out. We are going to obviously invite as many questions as you all are going to put in the Q&A box as we can get to before we officially close out. So with that, let me introduce our speakers today. And I'll start with Skye Perryman, who is President and CEO of Democracy Forward. And I welcome all the speakers to come onto the screen. Khalilah Harris is Executive Director at the Public Justice Center. Clarissa Martínez de Castro is Vice President at the Latino Vote Initiative at UnidosUS. Singh Attariwala is the Director of the Anti-Hate Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And Deadric Williams is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for the Study of Family Health and Wellbeing at the University of Texas-Knoxville. Welcome to each of you. As we move forward in our conversation, we're going to pause and we're going to launch the second poll, which you should see coming up on your screen, and take a few seconds to answer. Okay, I think we can close our poll, which was about exploring how DEI is increasingly labeled, quote, a threat in schools, workplaces, and government. And if we can pull up, oh, maybe it's just me, if we can show some of the responses. There we go. So the question really was to elicit how you react and see that statement, and just that many of you, a good portion, see it as a distraction from deeper economic inequities, a way to normalize structural discrimination, a way that power is being consolidated, authoritarian power, by fueling division among us. So thanks for responding. I want to pose this now to all of our speakers. And just by way of introduction, this is a shorter kind of elevator pitch, maybe. Tell us a little bit about the lens of your work, and share a little bit about what you're seeing in the attacks on DEIA. How are these attacks undermining multiracial democracy, which is a democracy where all people of all races, ethnicities, have equal voice, rights, and real access to participate and self-govern? Why do you feel compelled to respond? And what does an effective response look like for you, for your organization, and in your work? Skye, can we start with you?
Absolutely. And it's so great to be here. Thank you for having us all in this space. You know, the attacks on a multiracial democracy didn't start on Inauguration Day. And they didn't even start a few years before Inauguration Day, although the attacks have been building. They have always been here. And then they, of course, became intensified as the civil rights movement made progress in the 50s and 60s toward a multiracial democracy. There was an immediate backlash among many of the far-right groups that we are still seeing active in this space. They may have relabeled themselves or named themselves in other ways, but there was an immediate backlash And during the late 20th century, you had a range of far-right special interest legal groups building power in order to both, try to seed cultural division, try to divide people, and then also try to use the law and the legal and the court system in ways to turn the civil rights laws on their head, to seek to weaponize clauses like the Equal Protection Clause against the very individuals that it was designed to protect. And so what we are seeing now is the culmination of a multi-decade effort to set back civil rights progress. And we did see that intensify with the Supreme Court and with a range of states and local communities across the country that have come under further and further far-right leadership, particularly after 2013, when the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act, and you started seeing a range of voter suppression laws set in. And now we're, of course, seeing this on a national scale with the attacks that we've seen from this administration. And so we believe at Democracy Forward that attacks on civil rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion are attacks on democracy itself, and that there is no way to separate a true democracy from advocacy for and champion of these values and principles. What we are doing and what we believe and have seen is effective is to swiftly challenge swiftly bring legal challenges where we can in order to push back on the attempts to misuse the law and to roll back, to ground our advocacy in the experiences of real people and the communities that are being affected, understanding that sometimes those experiences and stories can cut through what is otherwise a pretty saturated and polarized kind of media environment. I want to emphasize to everyone that is tuning in, while we have had some wins, and we have had wins, and we'll probably talk about those, at times we've also had setbacks. But what we have seen in our work is that many of the actors that are seeking to undermine civil rights, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, including, by the way, the federal government in this instance, they're actually betting that people aren't going to push back. And we have seen just in the last few weeks in a number of our cases against the Trump administration that when we went to court on behalf of people, the administration itself backed off even before we had to win court orders. And we've also seen that at the state and local level, where a number of the groups, including the groups that were behind the Students for Fair Admission decision and those groups that have sought to shape things in local communities, where just showing up and showing that there is someone there that is willing to push back and say, we are not going to allow these values to go down without using every legal tool we can, every tool our democracy provides, has been an effective strategy. Even when sometimes we think, is this futile, or we might ask these questions, actually showing up and being present and showing that you will push back is an effective strategy. And then, of course, we've been able to achieve some additional wins through the actual strategies themselves, like the court decisions.
Thank you so much, Skye, both for what you just said, but also for all that Democracy Forward is leading in this moment. Khalilah, let's turn to you.
Thank you, Wendy, for having me. Skye, I can't agree with anything you said more. So again, I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris. I'm Executive Director for the Public Justice Center that's based in Baltimore. We've been around for 40 years. We're a public interest law firm focused on anti-racism and anti-poverty work. And I also want to provide a land acknowledgement for the land that I'm sitting on here in Baltimore. I sit on Lenape land, more specifically with the Piscataway and Susquehannock tribes. And I give gratitude for those who stewarded land that was unceremoniously stolen from them. Excuse me. And so at Public Justice Center and just in the community spaces where I'm serving, what we're seeing are people who might be intimidated by going to rent court. Landlords who might be taking a little bit of advantage as it relates to evictions or housing practices. Certainly employers who are somewhat insinuating that they might call ICE if people are pressing for their fair wages. And, for all of this, on the education space, we have an education stability project as well. And we know that the U.S. Department of Education's civil rights data collection will likely not happen anytime soon, and that there are a few hundred cases that are sitting with the U.S. Department of Education, which is responsible for addressing complaints around bias and unfair treatment in public education. You know, what's critical right now for us, or especially from me, and what I'm seeing is people who are living in a state of fear. And we really do appreciate the work of Democracy Forward and other organizations like that, that are immediately pushing back. What I hear too much of are people who are scrubbing their websites, scrubbing internal materials to remove concepts of equity and fairness from their practice. And that chilling effect can communicate to members of the team who do not have a racial equity analysis that it's not important anymore. We've seen boycotts around national brands and corporate brands who are retreating from DEIA. But the challenge for me is DEIA are just the current trend of initials for work that must continue, which is civil rights work. And it doesn't matter if you remove those words. The question is, what is the work that you're doing? And are we conveying to our clients? Are we conveying to the community members that we advocate with at the grassroots? Are we communicating to grass tops, to our elected officials, that it is not a priority anymore? And particularly in my space in public interest law, I'm seeing organizations that might be unwilling or reticent to accept grant monies from the federal government that would allow them to serve their clients and their partners because they're afraid of violating federal legislation around being honest about what they will do with the dollars. And if there is not immediate pushback to say we are going to continue to do the work that we've seen based on disparate impact and with the data that we've seen of the communities that need these supports the most, then you will be on a hamster wheel, right, of trying to figure out what words can I put down to make sure that I don't violate the False Claims Act and that they come back and snatch this money. So when you have volumes of organizations saying, I'm going to scrub my language, I'm going to scrub my website, I'm going to scrub my reports, I'm not going to use the word Black, I'm not going to use the word disability, I'm not going to have anything referring to LGBTQ, you know, you are communicating also to the people you are supposed to be supporting that perhaps it's not a priority. No one has the time to investigate if you're just wordsmithing so you don't violate the False Claims Act, and instead that perhaps in your organization you are retreating. And the last thing I'll say on that point is I have not been a fan of use of the DEIA label or any of the acronyms because sometimes it's been quite performative and not actually getting to the root of what we need to do to disrupt anti-Blackness, to disrupt poverty, to make sure that people have all the tools necessary to practice self-determination. And so there are organizations that purport to serve communities that perhaps they really don't have the analysis or don't have a specific strategy to ensure that people are not reliant on them anymore, and instead that they are getting full access and equitable access to the resources they need. So I'll stop there. That's what I'm seeing in my work, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Khalilah, and to all the work that Public Justice Center is leading, and the points that you've made about, you know, pre-compliance, and how vigilant we need to be. Sim, let's invite you into the conversation now.
Thank you, class, for having me at this panel. At Advancing Justice AAJC, we defend civil rights and advance policies that protect marginalized communities. And that includes our democracy programs like voting rights and census, as well as immigration and anti-hate. And we do this work in 38 states with over 300 organizations at the state and local level, with affiliates in Atlanta, Chicago, and California. And we also help work on impact litigation. But let me turn to the question at hand. DEI is about fairness and dignity, and I think we all understand that here in this room. But I want to be clear, it's not about partisan ideals. They're about ensuring that everyone has a fair chance to succeed and be valued. And that is foundational to democracy. In education, that means that students should still be able to reflect on how race and identity have shaped their experiences. In workplaces, that means these initiatives help source the best talent and ensure the best fair hiring and promotion practices. And in government, that means integrating the appropriate perspectives that are needed from all populations that they serve, particularly from historically underserved communities. But I'll also just, the underlying theme to all of this is that federal anti-discrimination laws were enacted to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, gender identity, disability, or background, has a fair chance to succeed. It's not about quotas or preferences for unqualified individuals. They're about ensuring that every deserving individual or community from diverse backgrounds are not overlooked in favor of those who do benefit from structural advantages. So this notion that these programs are uniformly unlawful or unconstitutional is wholly without basis. And as the Congresswoman had mentioned, these principles are not only supported by decades of bipartisan legislation, but also judicial precedent. And they are also grounded in our constitutional protections and rights. But let's look at the data. Data from the Department of Labor, Pew Research Center, and others show that Black, Latino, AA, and NHPI communities, women, and people with disabilities face persistent discrimination. So rather than addressing these disparities, recent federal actions have withdrawn support from the very programs that are designed to confront them. And I'll also point out that terminology, such as using the acronym DEIA, is being used to confuse and mislead the American public. So what are we seeing? We're seeing investigations and hearings designed to threaten and intimidate institutions, vague and confusing guidance inspired by the DOJ for broad interpretations, as well as the Department of Justice terminating a number of anti-hate crime grant prevention programs. What is even concerning behind all of this is it ultimately looks like it is an attempt to punish our constitutionally protected speech.
Sim, thank you so much. It was encouraging to hear, and as much encouragement as we can bring out in this conversation, just the reach of Asian Americans advancing justice across the country, and the attentiveness and, just the reminder that anti-discrimination or efforts to eradicate discrimination is about that proactive, right? That proactive removing of barriers. I think Clarissa, I'll invite you in next.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us today for this opportunity to be part of the conversation. I'm with UnidosUS, which is the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. We're multi-issue. We work on economic well-being and mobility, on health, education, and civil rights and immigration. And I like to say that we do our work through 3 Ps: policy, programs, and people. We have a network of nearly 300 community-based organizations across the country. So getting into the subject, one of the greatest assets our country has is its diversity. It has helped us innovate, problem solve, and navigate the complex world around us. Now, we all know that diversity does not translate into equity, inclusion, and access, but valuing it and respecting it is a key building block on that path. So perhaps it's no surprise that we're seeing a coordinated effort to undermine, to diminish the belief that diversity makes us stronger, which is a belief a majority of Americans have held. So when top leadership in this country uses their bully pulpits to whip up anxiety and fear, it leads to an environment of greater willingness to accept and propagate inequity. And that strategy includes dehumanizing and scapegoating, stripping away protections that safeguard rights, and promoting and implementing policies that marginalize communities and stoke division, fear, and violence. That is why Unidos feels compelled to respond. Yes, to protect, defend, and advance the well-being of the Latino community, and because we understand that this is a Take what is happening on immigration, for example. The president argues that lawlessness and crime are the reasons to forcefully deploy troops in American cities against the wishes of local elected leaders. But the reality from LA and other places tells a different story. Often unidentified, gun-toting masked agents are stopping people going on about their day without warrants or cause based on skin color or accent. And now, with the court's agreement, the majority of people they have detained without due process are immigrants without criminal records. And in the mix, they have harassed US citizens, intimidated or charged those who dare question what they were seeing, and attack freedom of the press. The administration is testing and pushing the limits of its ability to engage in these actions. It is no surprise that it has started with the most vulnerable, with tragic and even deadly consequences. But this is not just about persecuting immigrants. It's about testing how far those tactics can be applied well beyond. This is abuse of power and the fleecing of the American taxpayer. A load of contractors and corporations are lining up to line their pockets with taxpayer money being redirected away from programs American working families rely on. That same bill that cut food and health programs because, hey, there's no money, is giving DHS $165 billion to bring these tactics to the doorstep of communities across the country. So we must follow the money and the chain of corporations invested in these tactics without regard to the rights and true security of the American people. So at Unidos, we are standing together to demand accountability because Congress has a responsibility to provide oversight for these actions, and we can hold them accountable for that. We're also standing together to call out these abuses, to document them, to elevate them, because it is US citizens of color and immigrants today, but it will not stop there. And we have an all-out humanitarian response effort to help people in our network and beyond understand, know, and exercise their rights, and engaging in state and federal advocacy and pushing for that accountability and oversight at all levels while we defend against the erosion of key programs, because this is a test.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. Also, the reminder of the breadth of Unidos and the ways in which you're really engaging the power of your network to hold accountability, as you said. Deadric, let's get you into the conversation.
Hey, thanks, class, for having me on this esteemed panel. I appreciate all the viewers. My name is Deadric Williams. I'm an associate professor of sociology and the director of the Center for the Study of Family Health and Well-Being. I'm going to say this in our current political climate, that I am an independent scholar who does work on structural racism at the University of Tennessee and do not necessarily represent the university writ large, all right? So I'm coming to this as a scholar who have done my due diligence as a scholar to talk about the things that I care about, but also the things that I know. Part of what I do as a scholar is basically asking the question, why in the year of 2025, why is racial inequality still exists and persists in the United States? And much of the work that I do is guided by things like critical race theory, structural racism, and quantifying things like structural racism and how they have an impact on health disparities in the United States, but also things like poverty and economic hardship, people's inability to pay their bills, their rent, their mortgage, their health concerns, et cetera. And part of doing this, I often take a kind of historical perspective. So Skye's kind of approach with civil rights, my work tends to go back even farther than that. So I think about how to make sense of this thing called race. And so most people understand race as some socially constructed thing. But part of my work is really pushing us to think about what that means in reality. So instead of saying race is socially constructed, my work asks the question, race is socially constructed for whom and for what purpose. And so if we understand that racial categories are an invention to justify pre-existing inequities, then our understanding of racial inequality can help us to understand why it exists and why it persists. So for example, if inequality is already happening from land theft, genocide of natives, the enslavement of Africans, and then we invent categories to overlay on those atrocities, then it gives the appearance that a country that says they care about freedom, justice, and liberty to make it okay for genocide and chattel enslavement. So when we understand that racial categories themselves are a byproduct of power, and that the language we use is often an extension of settler colonialists, then I think we can have we bring a different conversation to the table. So much of what I do is connecting the dots. So the historical perspective from, let's say, the Dred Scott decision, for example, we can think about the ramifications that brought about, right? We can talk about the Civil War happening and then the Great Compromise of 1877, with Rutherford B. Hayes become president, federal troops leave the South, and so we have the rise of Black codes and Jim Crow laws. And so by the time we get to the earlier 20th century, kind of after the Civil Rights Movement, we get this rise of neoliberal ideology, Reaganomics, small government, et cetera, while not paying attention to all the harm that was caused during the slavery era, during the Jim Crow era, and never reconciling those particular set of ideas. So when we talk about DEIA, the critiques or anti-DEIA propaganda and disinformation, it's an extension of stuff that has happened long before many of us were born. So this is just a new iteration of the same thing, and the outcomes are always the same. That is, consistent disparities and disproportionalities in measures of well-being. And as a scholar, one of the things that I'm seeing, and I think many professors are struggling with, is when do our lives as professors end and our personal lives begin? So you have this kind of increased attack on scholars, whether they're posting on social media or they're being fired or things of that nature happening. So scholars who are trained in these particular events and systems of inequities, when we see it, to what extent can we call it out for what it is? The kind of preservation of whiteness is inextricably linked to anti-Blackness, anti-immigration, anti-LGBTQ plus, et cetera. So we have to look at these attacks in historical context and understand that these things are created to maintain a system that privileges some while simultaneously disadvantaging others. And the privilege is not necessarily isn't always a material privilege. There can be perceptions of what Du Bois calls the psychological wages of whiteness. That is that even though I may not have material benefits from a system that's full of inequities, the belief that one day I too can get access to those privileges, even at the expense of causing harm to others, then I am going to invest in that system, even if that system is not doing a good job for me and my life and my family. So I think there's a multi-pronged, as a scholar, a multi-pronged issue that has historical roots that has been linked to our contemporary reality. And so I'm gonna stop there because I can go on and on about this.
Well, people are appreciating what you're sharing, though. Every second there's something popping up in the chat. So I just want to thank you for that, Deadric. And I will move us in now to some conversation. Many of you have just talked about the historical context here. DEIA, born from civil rights, voting rights, immigration, nationality acts, with the Disabilities Act. But this is like decades of hard-fought policy reform, which is now being vilified and weaponized as a so-called threat across educational institutions. I don't think it was lost on any of us, Deadric, how you introduced yourself, and the caution that you and others clearly have to observe in this moment, unfortunately. and the boldness nonetheless, the courage to be here and continue your scholarship and speaking out. Not just our educational institutions, our workplaces, government, Skye mentioned in the beginning. I mean, undermining public trust, enabling structural discrimination. Everybody, I hope, knows the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who has warned recently and often that these efforts are designed to, quote unquote, come after the entire infrastructure that has been created from the civil rights movement. So Khalilah and Skye, maybe I'll engage you first in a mini conversation, just a couple minutes each. Khalilah, starting with you, through the lens of your work that you described in the beginning, what are the stakes for our democracy, not only federal, but at the state level? You started talking about what you're seeing in communities and among families. If DEIA and civil rights protections continue to be eroded, I mean, very practically, how do we move organizations, policymakers, funders beyond symbolic commitments to safeguard our equity, our justice infrastructure that's now under attack by all the legislation, executive orders, and including, importantly, budget cuts? So Khalilah, maybe a few minutes.
Thank you for that question. And, Dr. Williams, I completely agree with you. And I will say, again, the reason why I don't play in the acronym or the phraseology of certain things, for example, people will talk about microaggressions, and there's never anything micro about microaggressions. So how we got to using that phrase, I don't know. I do know, I'm studied on it, but I just push against the way we use language to obfuscate from what the core issues are that we need to address. One of the key civil rights laws, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which oftentimes people don't think about as a civil rights law, but the ESEA is wholly a civil rights law. And I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that the civil rights data collection will likely not be collected at the U.S. Department of Education, and that people are making civil rights complaints that are falling on deaf ears. And so here at PJC, our team members on our Education Stability Justice team are focused on data collection at the state level across the legal services and public interest legal space here in Maryland. We are coalescing around ensuring there is disparate impact law at the state level, so that we don't get pushback on whether or not we can continue to use the United States Constitution. And so I've seen that across the country as well. And when you ask, what is being eroded by the attempts to pull back on civil rights protections, I talked about organizations declining to take grant dollars because they don't want to sign attestations that might result in a False Claims Act violation. That is a challenge for the individual people, the people in communities who need access to those resources. And so you have people who have been doing the work to support communities and to provide access to opportunity, making decisions not to take funds from federal government. We also see the federal government withdrawing resources haphazardly from communities that the president dislikes, or somebody sneezes at him and he says, hope freeze their dollars, or whatever the case may be. This summer, we saw cuts to TRIO programs, which provides so many children access to exploring college and moving into higher education that we know can unlock liberation for many people. And so when we see those things happening, when we see capitulation and, like you said earlier, pre-compliance with some of this work, it impacts people on the ground. If we think about the cuts that are being made to SNAP and food for children and young mothers, when we see cuts that are being made to other programs for housing access, when we see monies being shifted, for example, from minority serving institutions to HBCUs, this is not a new set of practices, right? It is divide and conquer. It has caused people to fight against one another. So it was surprising to me to hear some HBCUs and organizations supporting HBCUs applauding money from the president, knowing that money was being taken away from other Black children and other Latino children and other Asian American children and Asian American and Pacific Islander children, so that money can go to HBCUs. It's really a shell game. And so day to day on the ground, this impacts people's individual lives, whether or not I can go back to school. We are seeing young people not being allowed to come back to the country to complete their studies. And that's a brain drain that will happen in the US and impact us heavily. The last thing I'll say about this is, you asked practically about how we move forward and what organizations should do. So as I said earlier, first and foremost, don't invest a lot of time in scrubbing language. Instead, invest more time in doing policy with people instead of to people. We really need to, in our space and in the seats that we sit, think about ways that we have allowed our judgment to supersede that of people who are directly impacted, or using or tokenizing those folk, or using people to show our funders that we are connected, but not actually digging into the types of policies that they want to see. Also, the core thing that I will say is that I implore people not to continue to fight for us to get back to where we were, because that was not justice either. We need to be thinking about what we deserve, what we should have had from the beginning in the greatest nation in the world that is flush with resources, and how we are put those things in place. This is going to be a long haul. Skye, I worked with many of your colleagues from OPM, my favorite guy, Rob Shriver, and some of those other folk. And, the federal government is going to take a good long while to rebuild. You don't lay off this volume of people. You don't terminate this volume of people and think, oh, at the next election, we'll just pick up and start moving where we were before. It's not going to happen. It's going to take decades, in fact, to rebuild. But what we do need to do is ensure that we're advocating and thinking through and doing some, it's hard when you're being beat up to think about what things should exist and to do strategy. But we have to look at what we should have had, what we ought to have, and build policy and strategy around that, and work with our elected officials, particularly at the local and state level, to put things in place that protect those things. Otherwise, we are going to be left wondering what is happening with deeper inequity, with a bigger wealth gap, with more people who are new Americans being shut out. And we don't want to see that.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I mean, you can see how lit up the chat is, and there's a lot of energy on this, including for all of us who are helping to move the conversation forward. Skye, I'm going to ask you to do the hard thing, just so we can leave a little time, make sure we're making time for Q&A. But could you just, in maybe 2 minutes, Skye, talk about, we see the bait and switch that's happening, it's worse than a bait and switch that's happening. How do we actually ensure that advocates and coalitions and the media, importantly, talk about compliance, are connecting these dots and framing everything that we're seeing every day, not as an isolated cut or a rollback on this, but as part of a very coordinated authoritarian strategy to roll back, to erode safety nets across immigration, education, labor, public benefits, health, right? All undermining multiracial democracy.
Well, in 2 minutes, we'll just solve it all. No, I'm joking. I think that is really what is so important about gatherings like this. And I'm not just saying that because we're all on it, but the siloing has to stop. And so what we have is we still have an ecosystem in the pro-democracy community that is too siloed among issues. At Democracy Forward, one of our theories of change and models of change is to help, create synergies and pathways and break through those silos. We know that whatever someone is a playbook, an autocratic playbook that's applying to one community or one issue will very soon be at another community or another issue, just like the poem goes, first they came for. But I think we all have to commit to what we can do in our professional lives and personal lives to break down those silos among issues, but also among tactics. One of the things that people have asked is, in the big ugly bill, there was all of these sort of isolated cuts, but then if you actually look at what's happening, there's this concerted, very clear connections between the ultimate undermining of a multiracial democracy, between white supremacy, and we have to, as advocates, be willing to expand our communities and break down the tactical silos. So what is a legislative issue is also a legal one, is also a people mobilization one, is also something we need to be writing about in the academy, all of that. And so I think that, we have some strategies and tactics that we've used at Democracy Forward to help do it. But I think it's really all the folks that are tuning in here that are sitting in from some particular vantage point, breaking down the silos. And then with this respect to the media environment, I think that we need to sort of distinguish, and I'll just be very brief. The media environment is broken. And so I think the question that we need to be asking is, how do we get this to resonate with people? Is it by using the media environment, or is it through resonating with people in new ways, right? Which is some of the new media and digital media, but also, movements and community-based organizing and some of the old school tactics. What's old is new again, because this fight is not a new fight. And so I think that that is one question I would ask us to reframe, not so much of how can we influence the media, but how can we influence people and make sure that this message is getting to the people? And what strategies do we need to do and utilize in what is a broken media environment? What that means is, and we've seen this in our work at Democracy Forward, when we file a lawsuit, that breaks through. And then people are talking about an issue that they may not be talking about without having something that breaks through. So we've got to focus on being newsmakers, not pundits. And I think, and through taking that action, whether it's, protests, marching, legal advocacy, taking that action helps shape the overall narratives, because the media is not going to be able to do it for us, given where the landscape is now.
Yeah, so true. So true. I hope everybody is pulling out these calls to action along the way. Okay, before we move the conversation on, we're gonna take a couple of questions that have come in. So, Khalilah, I'm gonna put this one to you, and maybe briefly, if you can. Any thoughts on how we push the reparations movement forward as integral to this resistance?
Great question, and I'll be brief. I sit on Baltimore City's inaugural Community and Reinvestment and Reparations Commission, and this particular commission is charged with distributing resources connected to the erroneous war on drugs. So we are in receipt of resources from cannabis sales in the state of Maryland and people who are seeking licensure to dispense cannabis. And so there are multiple ways. I've also written about this from an educational standpoint. There are multiple ways to address reparations. That is not only give me 40 acres and a mule. So when you're thinking about how to repair harm that has happened in your communities, name a specific thing. Don't fight that battle of people who want to talk about whether or not you get reparations, whether or not you're foundational Black, whether or not you're this or that. When it comes to education, reparations can look like dismantling use of property taxes to fund education, and instead ensuring that there is a uniform commitment to quality schools across the school district. It may look like eliminating zip codes to determine which school you can go to in your community, because we want to provide uniform access to the most quality schools and provide resources to support the schools that have been underfunded. So reparations does not have to just be cash payments. That's one thing that can happen, but you can talk with your legislators about forms of reparations that will immediately repair root causes. So land ownership. How are people getting access to be able to own the land in their communities instead of being perpetual renters? So I can go on and on about reparations, but those are some quick tidbits that you can use. Pick away at it and ask for big money to do particular things to people who have been historically harmed, instead of just waiting for the big pot of cash.
I'm gonna tell you, Khalilah, that was just right there. That was the first moment I felt hopeful today. So maybe we do come back ideally, because for those of us on the call that are trying to make change from every corner, in our communities. It's that kind of practical, right? Things that we can do. It is in our power to do them, that we need to be sort of building that, right? That toolkit from. So thank you so much for that. Sim, I want to pose one to you that came in. Why do you think this administration has so much support in their hateful rhetoric and rejection of DEIA? How do you think so many Americans are truly this hateful? Are folks simply brainwashed or ignorant? Sorry, Sim, big question to take on.
Yeah, I think we started this conversation talking about the upcoming census projections, right? So it is all being driven by fear. And I think that is central to understanding why a certain set of the American constituency is continuing to advocate for policies and also using rhetoric to demonize specific communities. We used to see the model minority myth being used to claim that some communities had somehow made it in America. But that flattens our communities and it didn't really encapsulate all of us in terms of our lived struggles and nuance. And it oversimplified things. But now what we're seeing is that there's no longer anything as a good immigrant. We're starting to see even the communities that were deemed to be the good immigrant communities now vilified. So we're seeing this rhetoric on H-1B visas, and it's followed by rhetoric around these communities are job stealers. So there's economic uncertainty that seems to be driving this argument over scarcity. But when we all unify, when we all come together and we all are trying to make this nation a better place for all, there's no scarcity there for us. There's abundance for all of us here. And I think to Skye's point, we do need to reach more American people. We do need to get those messages out as to where people live. And the other side of the constituencies are doing a really good job being persistent and consistently communicating with their members of Congress, consistently communicating with the tech platforms, consistently communicating with media, so that their perspective continues to be the one that wins the day. We need to see that kind of mobilization from our communities as well. And we can't just throw up our hands at this point, but we have to show that we are not communities to be feared. We are your neighbors. We are just as American as anyone else in this country. But there are inequities that we're trying to work towards to make this country better. And the entire concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion is being somehow illegal is now being used to attack the very people who are trying to make this country a better place for everyone. And so that is something that I think we all need to keep in mind, but we do need some new paradigms. And we'll certainly talk a little bit more later in the presentation about some of the data points about the hate that we're seeing against our communities.
Thank you so much, Sim. I'm gonna now questions are really coming in, so I'm gonna keep us moving. And Deadric, come to you. This one's a kind of a big one. We are, 62 years after the March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared how all of our fates are linked, our destinies are inextricably bound. But anti-Blackness today still permeates, as several folks said, and I'm remembering what Khalilah said in the beginning. And it permeates our policy, our narrative, reinforced by xenophobia, what Sim just said about bootstrap myths, and stereotypes that really cast Black people as lazy and criminal. These narratives are driving inequities in our housing, in our safety net system, in labor, immigration, right? Everything that we have mentioned. And it's leaving our communities too burdened by survival to fully engage civically. So what does it mean for democracy when entire communities are feeling powerless to participate? And this notion about interest convergence is being the answer, as Derek Bell warned. Civil rights only advance when aligned with white interests, especially in a nation where even poor whites vote against their own material interests while Black communities bear the brunt of systemic harm. What are your thoughts on this? And in a couple of minutes, Deadric.
Wow, you can't ask a professor that type of question and then say give a couple of minutes. Like this is a whole lecture. So I would try my best to keep it within the parameters for the respective time. But I want to start my response with a statement that there's a tendency for people to think of inequality as categories and not inequality as processes. So there's a tendency of thinking about these disparities as it belong to certain particular socially constructed groups, rather than the processes and mechanisms that give not only meaning to these socially constructed categories, but how they perpetuate inequality. So I'm gonna start there because I'm a process scholar, I care about understanding inequality through a process, right? So, and to do that, I want to also define terms. So this is the kind of professor in me coming out on this call. So when I think about systemic racism, for example, I tend to define it as this ongoing, ever-changing system of ideologies and structures that does three things. First, these ideologies and structures give the illusion that racial categories are real. They disproportionately benefit the dominant group, in this case, people who are racialized as white, and it disproportionately disadvantages those people who are racialized as Black or as Hispanic and Asian and natives in this country, right? So when we think of inequality in that way as a process, then it's not about the group themselves, but why the groups become meaningful to begin with. All right, so when we have these ideologies or these beliefs that human groups can be categorically organized and hierarchically structured, it lends itself to a type of prejudice via dehumanization. So if I dehumanize you enough, say that you're a criminal, you're a rapist, you're barbaric, you're non-human, then it gives way to the idea that my prejudice isn't illegal. I am doing this because I believe that you exist ontologically and or biologically in this way. Second, when we talk about structures, that is laws, policies, social practices, they often give way to discrimination via deservedness. Who deserves to have to get access to citizenship, right? Who deserves to have access to TANF? Who deserves these things? And so if I am believing that the world operates from a position that there are real ontological or biological groups, and these groups are, and there's meaning attached to these groups. Some groups are good, some groups are bad, for the sake of the example. I know that's oversimplistic, but I also can support policies and laws that says, hey, people shouldn't, quote unquote, leech off the system if I believe that these people are, quote unquote, lazy. So these ideologies and structures are often mutually sustaining, right? So when in that particular context, because inequality is a pre-existing condition for the creation of racial categories, when things like DEIA arise, it's not only the divide and conquer, it's not only fear, which are extremely important, but for me, it's about the assumption that equity is viewed as a zero-sum game. That somehow, some way, if there's access, if I give a person who's been deemed as non-human humanity, then somehow I am in competition with that person for valued resources, right? So that the fear of scarcity comes back around. If people can get access to the same water fountains, bathrooms, schools, neighborhoods, right? There is this assumption that I am going to lose something if someone else is gained access to these resources. So I'm saying all of this to say the reason why these things, one of the reasons why these things are ongoing is largely because there's a large percentage of Americans who still think that racial groups are biologically real groups, and that laws and policies should restrict access to people who are non-deserving of these particular resources because they don't know how to quote unquote act. Again, I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of time. And so when we think about the March on Washington, or to finish the question, people who are particular people who are racialized as Black are like here we go again, right? Like here we go again. We've seen this, and especially talking to older Black folk in my family, like this isn't new, right? Like here we go again. At the moment that we push for opportunities like civil rights movement and civil rights legislation, now it's the rug is being pulled underneath our feet again, right? And my encouragement is not interest conversion is a bit tricky. I'm, like it shouldn't be someone else's benefit to help people who don't benefit from structural conditions. We should be doing it because it's a human good, right? Like the belief that people with unequal distribution of resources somehow, some way is the cause of their own calamity is preposterous to me, given the history of this country. But those are the narratives that are often uttered. So there's and I'm to be transparent, even as a scholar, sometimes I feel like why do this work? Why continue to write these papers? Why continue to teach these courses if a large percentage of people still believe that human beings are biologically different and there's value meaning attached to these particular groups? And so the pushback, my encouragement is that although these particular times seems extremely frustrating, there were times in which people weren't deemed as human beings and people fought, right? And so one of the things that I often encourage people is that one thing for sure and two things for certain is that people racialized as Black have always created adaptive strategies to push back against white supremacy as a system. And I think on this call and what we're talking about today are potential strategies that people can use to push back against this system. Because at the end of the day, I think hope is what most of us have, and to lose that can be devastating in a number of ways. So anyway, I'm gonna leave it there, and understanding inequality as a process, not necessarily as categories.
Yeah, I mean, that is going to stick with me. The way you opened everything you said, the process, the process, inequality is a process. There's a lot of sharing, both questions in the chat. I know we're not going to be able to respond to them one for one today, but it begs some sharing after this call and follow up to this conversation, and really want to invite contribution to that. And folks are sharing, Dr. Williams, some of your research, your scholarship in the chat. So just acknowledging that. We're gonna do another pivot. So everybody take a deep breath, and we're gonna put up a poll to kind of center everybody in the next conversation we'll have. Okay, I hope folks have had a couple of seconds to react to that prompt. And if we close the poll in a few seconds and put the results up, really prompting us to think about immigration in a multiracial democracy. And I think the results are coming up shortly. There we go. So the prompt was the expansion of immigrant detention, including military bases as makeshift prisons, represents, and the majority, well, the plurality of us see it as an authoritarian strategy to weaken multiracial democracy, a racialized system, a process for criminalizing survival and access. Thank you for those responses. And Clarissa and Sim, I'm going to invite you both to help lead this part of the conversation. Immigrant rights are inseparable from what we understand as DEIA, and attacks on immigrant communities are part of the broader authoritarian strategy that we're talking about to weaken our multiracial democracy. We have seen policies that are expanding detention, uses of military posts as makeshift Alcatraz-like facilities. We are targeting longtime residents and workers and weaponizing Medicaid enrollment data for deportation and intensifying workplace raids, just what we've seen in the past few weeks in Georgia and other places, and now reinforced by the Supreme Court ruling. I can't even remember what day it was. I think it was Monday, that opens the door to racial profiling and greater immigration enforcement, racial profiling in immigration enforcement. Some communities of color and immigrant populations have supported these very attacks. It's hard to sit with, really illustrates how xenophobic appeals can fracture us, fracture our solidarity, normalize exclusion. So, Clarissa, how can we move beyond traditional defensive strategies to reframe immigration as central to the fight for democracy itself? How can coalitions, including how UNIDOS is responding, but policymakers and advocates alike, process and respond to this troubling dynamic where segments of our immigrant communities, our Latino communities, are aligning with anti-immigrant policies so that we can build a stronger multiracial democracy that actually resists detention and mass deportation and criminalization? So Clarissa, I invite you to jump in first on this one.
Hi there. So I think we have to start by questioning our own assumptions and continuously doing that, right? So it is interesting to me, for example, that we, in talking about immigration and this very, very expansive kind of question for discussion, the piece that was more keenly elevated is these communities are falling for xenophobia and are voting or supporting detention policies, et cetera, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing. The reason I say that is because I don't think that's accurate. First of all, if we look at election results, we see that a majority of Latinos did not support the person voicing these tactics, one. And two, that even while we saw an increased number of Latinos move to support the current president, that the dominant driver there was economic anxiety, which I think takes us back to the beginning of these conversations, right? How do you stoke or how do you undermine the generally held belief that diversity makes us stronger is exactly by stoking fear and anxiety. And economic anxiety is the first step. So that's kind of what we're seeing there. Now, the other thing that is apparent is that while there was a lot of concern in the general electorate about the chaos that was at the border, and that led people to say that they were okay with mass deportations, whatever that may be. When the whatever that may be was dug into a little bit more, you started seeing people say, I'm not okay with that, right? And so it is important to understand those things because that's what's going to help us communicate more effectively with our fellow Americans as we seek to come together. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we can take the perfect example of people engaging with this issue that are often not seen as directly associated with it is the Black community. There isn't a group, whether you're talking about legislators or voters, who have greater levels of support for protecting the rights of immigrants. Next to them are Latinos, who many of us would say, hey, Latinos should be higher than that. But that also assumes different patterns in these electorates. The reality is that, interestingly, most times when people in our country think about Hispanics, They assume that the majority are immigrants and undocumented, and often only approach us when immigration comes up. So when you stop to see that 8 in 10 Latinos in the US are US citizens, and of the remaining 2, 1 is a legal immigrant and 1 is undocumented, then that brings more interest to why is this community so deeply involved in the issue of immigration? And part of that is, yes, we have a direct connection with it. And the other one is that we also generally see how when immigration goes toxic, it impacts the civil rights and civil liberties of all Latinos. But I think that for members of the progressive community, it's important to understand how economic discontent and economic anxiety has so deeply impacted so many people in our country that many were willing to kind of look the other way or hope for the best while trying to punish whoever was in power at the time to look for an alternative. And that's why it's also important to see that right now, that economic discontent, that many folks who decided to kind of hope for the best are also more discontent about the economy right now and what it may bring for them in the future. So there are opportunities there, but I think that we need to figure out how to connect the dots. And perhaps the way at the beginning, how we talked about immigration already provides an example. What's happening on immigration is helping people see that it really is a petri dish to test abuse of power and tactics that are going to be used well beyond immigration.
Exactly. Sim, okay, let's make sure we get your perspective, and then I'm hoping that we can open up for one more question. But and you spoke to this already, Sim. We know Asian American communities have faced a surge in hate during the Trump era and beyond. And yet many are still supporting the very policies that these leaders are driving and that are creating harm. So at the same time, the model minority myth that you talked about is being weaponized to divide communities of color, right? And obscure what's actually happening and the systemic inequities. So how do we reconcile these contradictions? We've got anti-immigrant policies being backed by some within the AA and NHPI communities, rising hate, myth of exceptionalism, and how do we actually move beyond defense to build a more perpetual solidarity with communities of color in protecting equity and protecting our multiracial democracy?
Yeah, I think Clarissa definitely spoke to some of the driving factors there for our community. The contradictions certainly reflect not just political, but it's psychological and historical, and it's shaped by exclusion and assimilation pressures and survival strategies. But when we want to reconcile this, we have to name these issues that are happening. And certainly there are more efforts that we could be doing to address that within our own communities who may be susceptible to these xenophobic narratives. And that solidarity requires us to confront that together. And moving beyond defense, we need to make sure that there's pre-bunking strategies, and such as making sure that our community is aware that the model minority myth is being used as a Trojan horse. It's presented as praise to our communities, but it unleashes chaos, and it's designed to tear us apart from within. And that is something that we certainly need to have more conversations around. But let's look at our history as well. When it comes to the exclusion of Asian Americans, it has been rooted in xenophobia and economic anxieties. We also saw in the COVID-19 era scapegoating and national security narratives, where the Trump administration enabled that scapegoating, which fueled anti-Asian hate. And today, Chinese Americans are being targeted through election rhetoric and policies like the China Initiative, which labels them as national security threats. We're also seeing alien land laws that are being reintroduced at the federal level and state level to prohibit land ownership, looking to take our country back to pre-civil rights era exclusions. But the South Asian community has also borne the brunt of the H-1B visa debates because they're again being demonized for being job stealers. And extremist groups are calling for violence against Indian Americans after an August 12th Florida crash involving an Indian truck driver. And even South Asians in their own Republican Party, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who was running for Ohio gubernatorial position, facing white supremacists and rallies against his campaign and death threats from within his own ranks. And then the White House AI advisor, Srinam Krishnam, faced racist abuse after his appointment. And the data here reveals the depth of hate. Advancing Justice AAJC's analysis of the FBI's hate crime data in 2024, which was released last month, shows that anti-Asian hate crimes remain nearly 3 times higher than pre-pandemic averages. Anti-Asian hate has not gone away, but I am concerned that going forward, as our communities, and not just Asian communities, but many other communities who are impacted by hate, lose trust and confidence in the institutions of government, that they are not going to report crimes, including hate crimes, to the government. That doesn't mean that hate crimes and discrimination is going away. It is turning invisible. So we need to do more to address with our policymakers right now about how they need to prepare for that eventual invisibility of data. But there is a lot of work ahead for us, and we are certainly at an inflection point. Today, it could be immigrants. Tomorrow, it could be gender, gender identity, disability, rural status. These are all classifications, one could argue, are part of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And that category can continue to grow. As Clarissa has said, the testing ground against immigrants is part of the cruelty to inflict it on the rest of American society. And that is something that we all need to be extremely vigilant about.
Thank you, Sim. I'm holding on, right? These nuggets that are coming through the conversation about how we take action now and in the coming days, and just your the word pre-bunking is really standing out for me from what you had shared. I think okay, we're gonna get one more question in right now, and if we can kind of treat this as a lightning round to the respondents. We're going to go back one step. Somebody had put in the chat, Dr. Williams, while you were talking, that you were, I think at the time, talking about sort of this divide and conquer strategy. So, Khalilah, and then maybe Dr. Williams, come to you. If you can talk about the importance of using language that speaks to poor white folks and helping them to understand that they are victims of the wealthy and powerful, not poor Black and brown people.
Thank you. Just to share airtime, because I did drop a response in the Q&A, I'm happy to pass to someone else.
Oh, thank you so much. I wasn't watching that there. Dr. Williams, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I will be brief here. I think this question is extremely important in that it recognizes that part of the issue is getting people who are racialized as white and economically poor to view that their particular that this ideal of race is much more important than their economic well-being, right? And we have a history of that in Bacon's Rebellion, right? Historical context there. We know that it exists. But how we do this, I think there has to be strategic ways to whether that's via data or grassroots not either or, but grassroots efforts to demonstrate these particular concerns as well. Now, my work isn't on this, but I know somewhat about this in terms of people, quote unquote, voting against, which I don't like the idea of people voting against their own interest. People aren't voting.
I'm there with you.
They're voting. Their interest is, you may disagree with their interest, but from their perspective, they're voting in the theorem, sociological theorem, situations defined as real are real in their consequence. So if I perceive something to be true to me, then I am going to move in a particular way that I feel like I am gaining interest in, not against any of my interests. So we have to be careful with that type of language. And given that context, then there has to be a mobilization efforts and data to demonstrate to people like, hey, you're not winning either. And just as an aside here, there has been a growth in videos from people from like Nebraska and Kansas who have said they have voted for the current administration, but yet they are in dire conditions because no one is working, who tend to be disproportionately people of color, right? So part of, and I don't, okay, I don't think that's a concern in and of itself. I think that concern is a type of interest convergence. I care about the decision that this administration have done only because it has directly impacted me now. If it didn't impact the person who's giving these videos about showing their farmland and there's nobody on it to work and they're losing money, etc., it only is a concern because it has put a dent in their own pocketbooks. And I think with this context, there could be mobilization and data to demonstrate this is not new. These particular techniques has been around since forever and a day. So I think my encouragement here is to think about things like demonstrating via data and mobilization efforts to demonstrate to people like this isn't new. This is actually part of the plan. So you're getting the quote unquote short end of the stick is part of the scare tactics that we talked about earlier, etc.
Yeah. If I may,
I saw you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yes,
just
I think
try to
I just
go
wanted to
quickly.
say that we don't do a good enough job painting an accurate story of how diversity makes us all stronger and the country overall. We need to tap enlightened self-interest. The reality is that a hell of a lot of American working families are struggling. And while they may not buy some of the explanations that are being sold, they are facing some existential situations at the same time that they are being surrounded on social media and elsewhere with an explanation to what's happening. And when you are being subjected to mis and disinformation in a story that makes sense 24/7, it sticks. And I think that for us, we're kind of in the middle period about educating folks about what's happening in our communities, but haven't so much created that story about all of us and how all of us have a stake in this and benefit from that asset that is diversity, and fully realizing it by advancing equity and inclusion and access.
You, Clarissa, you're demonstrating to us exactly how we need to show up as you continue to repeat, right? In everything you say, diversity is our strength and we believe it, right? And this is how the majority of us feel. Okay, I think we're gonna go to our last poll. So we'll ask for our facilitators to pull that up. Take a few seconds. There we go. We'll give it a few more seconds and then close the poll. This one is really, reflecting on, for example, what just passed Congress in July with this reconciliation. Massive, massive cuts to housing, health, and safety nets. So if we can close the poll, we'll see how we are understanding these massive cuts to our well-being. Folks see it as a deliberate strategy that deepen inequities in health and housing, policies that criminalize poverty and disability, our queerness, coordinated assaults on the safety net that actually underscore and sustain authoritarian power. Okay, and with that, we'll reset to the next part of our conversation. Skye, I'm gonna pose this one to you. In all of these attacks on housing and health programs and federal agencies, you talked a lot about that. Democracy Forward is protecting a lot of federal workers that have been harmed across housing and urban development, health and human services. These aren't just budgetary cuts, they're policies that are exacerbating our health inequities, homelessness, and already distressed communities of color, right? While compounding inequities for LGBTQ communities, folks with disabilities. In places like federally qualified healthcare centers, which serve as lifelines for these populations, equity work itself, right, is now prohibitive. This is at the center of what these providers for our communities actually do. And the attack is now leaving frontline providers unable to even name or address systemic barriers. So it's obviously a dangerous paradox. The very institutions that are designed to serve our communities are being stripped of the tools to ensure equity and justice. So how can legislators and funders and coalitions, all of us on this call, advocates, collectively confront these attacks by both protecting critical safety nets and also defending the infrastructure of equity work itself?
Well, certainly the legislators need to get to work, and we haven't seen that. And so, I mean, it's not the lack of a brilliant policy that's been proposed. It's the lack of a moral imagination and commitment to our democracy that has, that is resulting in a lack of legislative response. I do think people need to continue to make their voices heard and to push. Litigation here is a tool, and a lot of funders still do not think about litigation as a tool. Litigation has always been a tool for people to be able to utilize their power. It has been a tool and was a tool in the early 20th century for people to utilize their power, even when the votes were not there, so to speak, on the Supreme Court for many justice issues. Without that litigation, you would not have had the people movements that ultimately became the progressive era of American politics. Without that litigation, you would not have the dissenting opinions that you saw from justices like Harlan earlier and then Brandeis later that became the building blocks of the civil rights jurisprudence that would later win the day in the 50s, 60s, and to some degree the 70s. And so I just want to make sure that everyone is understanding we have to utilize that. And I say that not just because I lead an organization that does litigation work. We do legislative work too, but because that is a tool in this time. Much of what is happening is a violation of the First Amendment. And we have not had a court yet say that what the Trump administration is doing with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility complies with the First Amendment. There are some issues happening in the cases about sort of where injunctions are that are making it difficult for people on the ground. But I think we need to be very clearly focused that we have not seen a court say that anything that this administration has done in its campaign on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is lawful. With respect to HUD and HHS, we are litigating the grant certifications and they're blocked right now. So I would suggest that people that are funding organizations or that have leadership positions at organizations or direct service providers are asking real questions about what is and is not prohibited, not where we are concerned that because of a pre-compliance issue, we may want to go ahead and modify our conduct. But that said, in some states, including my home state of Texas, there are complications for the services that are being provided because of the draconian laws. And even though those laws, frankly, don't satisfy any type of constitutional inquiry, advocates are caught between a rock and a hard place. And so my real call to action for the funders is to fund all strategies, not one strategy, but you need to be funding all strategies because we don't know which one will work. In some instances, just a communication strategy creates enough pressure that that we're able to make inroads. And other strategies you have to litigate, and other strategies you have to legislate. And it's the combination of those and the lack of siloing of those that's going to be really important. My call to action for folks that are dealing with all of this on the ground is to really understand the law. We can help you with that at Democracy Forward, democracyforward.org. Please reach out. We help you free of charge. But in addition to, and the tremendous civil rights groups and public justice, I mean, there's a number of us that will do it. I'm just saying, reach out. There are people that will do it for you. We're happy for you to reach out to us. And then number two is you've got to get serious about what tools you're going to use, including initiating litigation. because we have been able to save a number of direct services programs in this moment with this administration because people were willing to step up and say, you are asking me to certify something that is a violation of the First Amendment, that's a violation of a range of other laws. But those things are not going to be handed down from Congress. And there's not like a broad national solution right now with where the political environment seems to be. We've got to work on that, their people mobilization. But you can litigate and amplify and demand on particularized programs. And there's a broad pro-democracy community that we are here to help you do that. We work with all the groups on the phone or all the groups on this webinar. All of us are willing to help or get you to someone that will help. And that's what we really want people to understand.
That's great, Skye. Thank you. Khalilah, I'm coming to you next, and you've mentioned it. We haven't yet tapped the fact that you have worked at the intersection of federal education, workforce development, and also beyond, and including now in the state of Maryland. So this, I'm going to ask you to respond in 2 minutes, but that's unfair to you, I know. But here's the question. As DEIA is being attacked in the classrooms, in our curriculum, in higher education, and we are facing all kinds of defunding scenarios, if education is actually the foundation of our democracy, what happens when equity is itself stripped from the classroom? And importantly, how can educators and parents and policymakers practically, protect inclusive education in this moment?
Great question, and I love it, and I'll keep it brief. First and foremost, run for school board. People underestimate how many battles and the aggressive war being waged at the school board level so that people can control the curriculum, can instill fear in educators and school leaders. And so it's important for people to step up. If you're willing to serve on the PTA, pivot and see if you can have a little chat and chew for people to raise money for a school board campaign for you. The second thing I'll say is that any quality educator who is going through supervision and who is being evaluated by a school leader or instructional leader should be implementing and instituting culturally responsive education as a matter of practice. And that does not necessarily mean Black History Month. We're going to talk about Martin Luther King, and Hispanic Heritage Month. We're going to sing my hero Celia Cruz's music, or whatever the case may be. That is not what I'm talking about. Are children being met where they are? Are their needs being responded to? If you know a child is coming unfed to school, are you making sure that they can get into the cafeteria, get a little more food, and make sure they're not disruptive in the classroom? Are the instructors being trained on how to ensure that they are responding to the needs of the children in their classroom? This question that was asked about people who are low resource white folk. Listen, if you are in a town that is 99% white, there's a ton of diversity happening there. People are coming with different experiences and different levels of resources. And if you're a quality educator, whether it's at the K-12 level or in higher education, the question is, how is your practice ensuring students are developing critical thinking skills, that families are being supported, that people have access to the resources they need so their children show up prepared to learn? And so at the school board level, with your school superintendents and CEOs, all of those are places where you need to be vigilant and paying attention and not kind of sit back and saying they're doing this thing to us. The last thing I'll say, relying on both the power of the indigenous people who were here stewarding this land before we got here, and my ancestors from the diaspora. Let's take Saturday morning class. Let's take Sunday school. Let's take the afternoon after you've gone to worship at the mosque. Let's take Saturday morning, back at the synagogue, whatever that is. We have always had our own power, and we cannot relinquish our power to say that somebody is going to do something for us or to us. So it's important that we reignite those things. And I go back to the point of mutual aid. If you see that things are lacking in public systems, step up and coalesce and provide those to your community.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for that. I found myself reflecting on back to school night, which for me was last night at my kids' school, and actually seeing some of this reinforced in multiple ways and just feeling some relief. Thank you for those reminders, right? These are simple things that we can do there, and they're fundamental. Sim, I'm going to play off of this a little bit. You've also worked in federal government. You've worked at other civil society positions to expand justice and combat hate crimes and also address religious discrimination. So what role do faith leaders and moral voices play in countering these attacks? And especially when political leaders and segments of the faith community themselves are amplifying hate and xenophobia.
Yeah, I think I want to start again in encapsulating some of the great conversation that was brought to surface today. The attacks on diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion are deflecting blame, and they redirect the public frustration towards those people that are making our systems more fair. And the irony is that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives lawfully exist precisely because our institutions have failed to deliver fair opportunities for all Americans. And stripping that away does not fix our broken systems. And so the efforts to dismantle it only deepen the government intervention failures, and it sends a dangerous signal that our constitutional commitments to fairness are negotiable valuables. They are not negotiable valuables. In the long run, it'll expose more Americans to the unwillingness of those in power to confront those challenges. I've seen firsthand how DEIA policies like language access, inclusive hiring, and affinity groups create more pathways for civic engagement and justice. And defending those values is not optional. It's essential for preserving democracy. The communities have been harmed include those that I belong to as an Asian American, but that's not to suggest that I'm only activated when an attack only happens against my community. When we see a threat to one community, it's a threat to all of us. So in my work, we've centered community voices. We've built coalitions across identities, including faith, and to push for policies that remove barriers, not just symbolically, but structurally. And we have to make clear that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is not a zero-sum game. And I know that's been a theme that we have all shared throughout this conversation. But faith leaders are moral anchors. In times of rising hate and division, faith leaders have historically played a critical role in affirming human dignity and calling communities to higher moral ground. Dr. Williams, I think, has done a really fantastic job of sharing some of that moral clarity and higher moral ground that is needed in our communities. But those faith leaders are the voices that can transcend political divides and offer that language of compassion and justice and shared humanity that I think a lot of Americans are hungry for. And so if you look at it, diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion is deeply spiritual and moral, and it has a lot of parallels in faith practices. It's these values, these traditions of compassion, justice, dignity, and care for the marginalized that we have to continue to center. And these are not just policy goals, they're moral imperatives that allow our society to function with fairness and mutual respect. But today, even faith leaders are under attack, and we're seeing a disturbing trend where politicians and influencers are demonizing clergy and moral voices who speak out against injustice, especially when their views challenge dominant political narratives. Whether it's opposing xenophobia or advocating for immigrant rights or supporting diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, these leaders are being labeled as woke or radical. And that's a tactic to silence dissent and to discredit moral voices. Authoritarian actors are aiming to strip movements of their ethical legitimacy. And it's not just policy, it's about controlling the moral narrative of who belongs in this country and who deserves dignity. And that experience that I've had in federal and civil society roles, I've worked with faith leaders who've stood up against hate and seen humanity in one another, supported survivors, and built bridges across racial, gender identity, legal status, disability, and religious divides. Their courage is essential, but they need support and protection. So faith communities are not a monolith. They should not be generalized as aligning with the anti-DEI movement, but we have to uplift more of their voices, and that means creating platforms for interfaith solidarity, equipping leaders with tools to counter hate, and ensure they're not isolated when they speak truth to power.
Yeah. Thank you, Sim. Um, we're starting to come to the end of our conversation. I want to make sure I leave time for kind of last thoughts from each of you. Very powerful remarks that you shared in this conversation. But let me try to pose one or two more, if we can challenge ourselves to maybe keep it to a few minutes each. In this conversation about what Congress has just done through the reconciliation bill, really deepening harm, imposing work requirements, right? Cutting basic needs programs. Dr. Williams, want to come to you and help us to understand, what it means for democracy when programs that are actually meant to keep our families healthy are being weaponized as tools of racial control, and some practical advice about how we as advocates can document the racialized health fallout of these policies and these budget cuts, and then importantly, frame the conversation in ways that mobilize voters and advocates and not just sort of policy experts.
All right, I will do my best here. So I think part of the question is much of the question is the kind of restricting access to programs and how that kind of impede health and equality. And one of my areas of research is structural racism in health, particularly physiological health response systems. So to be brief with this answer, I want to do this with a metaphor. So living in East Tennessee here, I'm from rural Mississippi. So living in East Tennessee, there's bears that I've discovered here. And so imagine, and the human body, so imagine you walking and then a bear jumps out, right? And the human body responds to that. Our flight and flight system occurs, right? So you're either going to fight the bear or run away from that bear. I'm going to run away from that bear because I'm not that brave. So as I'm running away, my physiological response system is activated, right? My cortisol levels increase. My hands are sweaty, mom's spaghetti, right? Like part of who I am as a human being is responding to that particular stress. If I run away from that bear and survives, then my body gets back to equilibrium. My blood pressure decreases, my cortisol levels decrease and get back to kind of homeostasis, right? But what if I'm walking and I meet a bear every day? And our bodies aren't designed to handle chronic stress, right? Our bodies are designed to deal with acute stress, like periodically we have a stressor. But when you take programs in that way, you exacerbate already pre-existing racial inequities. And so what if that bear every day is poverty? What if that bear every day is not having enough food to eat? What if that bear is my federal and state governments? What if that bear is the very program I need, I'm being restricted from, that will help me and not only myself, but my children's well-being as well. So when I'm tackling a bear that's in terms of restriction to access to resources, value resources for food, TANF, etc., then that metaphorical bear every day is wearing and tearing on my physiological system that puts me at greater risk for cardiovascular disease and a whole host of health calamities. So my particular argument here is to recognize the metaphorical bear can be the people the people who are writing laws and policies. That bear could be legislators, etc. And so my encouragement to people is the key thing here is to recognize and find ways to create equilibrium, whether that's through, and I'm gonna sound real cheesy right now, but the truth of the matter is these things are happening. So finding ways to balance oneself, whether that's through calming apps or through some type of to kind of keep one's body. But that's really difficult to say when you're hungry, and I recognize that. But at the same time, that the harshness of that metaphorical bear needs to be identified and create strategies to push against it. So I'm gonna close it right there.
I went the whole way with you on that arc. I was like, East Tennessee, bears. That's not where I thought you were gonna go, but that is now going to stick with me. And then I did, right before you said calming app, I felt myself take a really deep breath and then sort of brought myself back down again. But anyway, thank you for that. Okay, this has been an incredible conversation. I really want to make sure that we get every single one of your voices in for some final remarks. So I'm gonna jump over. Clarissa, I had a last question for you, and I'm sorry, but I want to give you the floor first. And the question I was gonna pose to you, Clarissa, because you have this vast network and a lot of visibility across what I think we should fully expect is coming in terms of copycat legislation at the state and local level, but also a lot of the practical advice that that you all have shared with us on this call about absolute steps that we can take in our own communities to thwart this authoritarian regime. I'm going to turn to you first, and here's the question for everybody, but Clarissa, please start. If you could equip participants with one tangible way that you can address the attacks on DEIA and the threats to our multiracial democracy, what would it be and why? And maybe just a minute or two each.
All right. Well, look, we're seeing modern tools applied to an ancient strategy of divide and conquer. That strategy means dehumanize and scapegoat, strip away protections that safeguard rights, and promote and implement policies that marginalize communities and further stoke division, fear, and violence. So we need an all of community response. And that means that there are small roles and big roles to play behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. So my shorthand is be a pro, prepare, respond, and organize. Prepare by knowing your rights and helping others do the same, whether in the immigration context or in your right to speak up and your ability to vote and help others do that. Respond by connecting to rapid response networks locally and documenting and filming what you see is happening, and speak up. And organize. This can mean different things depending on your perch. Be a storyteller that amplifies the stories of what you're seeing in your community. Be an advocate that demands that Congress does its oversight job and lift up when they don't. And play different strategies at the state and local level to either thwart some of these efforts or advance progress. And focus on accountability, follow the money, and educate those around you to see who is truly benefiting from the suffering we're seeing. And you can also be a healer who disseminates tools to take care of ourselves and our mental health in response to that bear, and connects with families in their time of need.
You are all such pros. There's a lot of people love that acronym. Thank you so much for that very practical homework and counsel. Sim, can we go to you next?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I agree. We want to equip ourselves and our community with the tools needed to name and challenge the misinformation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Because these terms are often cloaked in confusing language like woke and illegal and divisive or weaponized to obscure the truth. But we have to learn and teach how to decode that rhetoric and educate others in our communities. And we can expose the real intent, which is opposition to fairness, inclusion, and accessibility. And I agree with some of the recommendations mentioned. Certainly host some teach-ins or community briefings. Share some plain language resources that explain what DEIA really is. Advancing Justice AAJC recently worked with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and others to publish a fact sheet about the use of race in college admission applications. We also put out a What You Need to Know resource in collaboration with organizations, including Democracy Forward, on what the DOJ's recent guidance on federal funding is. And we also want to encourage people to ask, are you really against diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? And make them say it out loud, not behind acronyms. And what matters is when the misinformation goes unchallenged, it spreads. But when we name it clearly, we remain a part of the narrative, and we build that solidarity rooted in truth. And we want to make sure our members of Congress have more disaggregated reporting and data. And we need to fund our chief diversity offices and DEI task forces across federal agencies and institutions, and strengthen that oversight over the DOJ and many other institutions that are responsible for these historic, bipartisan, long-standing pieces of legislation.
There's like a brilliant call and response happening in the chat. Thank you so much to both Sim, you, and you sort of called on Skye. So Skye, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I think I would just say two things: courage and clarity. And here's how those get really practical. Courage is a practice, and you sort of have to fake it till you make it. And it's not the one thing that you will do that is courageous, some big, headline thing. It's a series of little actions every day. And so, for those that are encountering professional environments where there are pressures to pull back on important work that's happening, to change language, I think we have to get very precise in those environments and really, put the institutions through their paces. Find a way through it. And to do the best we can in those series of situations. And then, of course, when you're in leadership or have a degree of power over the outcomes, there is a greater responsibility to exercise courage, and we're all contending with that. Clarity is, just to pick up on what others have said, is really to be quite clear about what's happening, both with respect to not getting confused about silos, or about one community being pitted against another community, or one issue, one quote issue being different than another issue. To be very clear that this is an attack on all of us, and to hold that moral clarity and find ways to exercise it. And then the clarity of telling the truth, of speaking truth, the fact sheets that we've been putting out. There's a range of things that people can do. There's a range of things that people can do to evidence that clarity. So courage and clarity. And then, of course, I will always say, don't forget courts. Courts are not going to save the day. There's no lawsuit that's going to get us out of where we are. We don't believe that. We believe it's going to be people. But in many of these instances where there are dead ends right now with other tools, sometimes the initiation of litigation, or the posture of initiating litigation, can help really push, and enforce some better results.
Thank you so much. Okay, Khalilah, and then Deadric, will come to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the key thing that I would say is put your phones down and close your computer screens. We have seen a ton of research coming forward about how isolation is propelling hate and propelling situations where people are experiencing depression and anxiety from the incoming of what's happening on big media, or frankly, artificial intelligence created media, fake news, if you will, coming across our timelines and feeds. We've also seen a vast number of school districts that are asking children to put their phones into fiber pouches and put them away for the day, and how much success they're having with the children talking to each other, learning how to relate to one another, asking questions. Their curiosity is beginning to increase again. If we don't talk to one another, if we only use technology for that, and I'm not someone who decries against AI, because it can be extremely useful in justice work, but we have to figure out how to connect in real life. And it seems like very basic advice. I run a public interest law firm. Absolutely, we're going to continue to use appellate advocacy and legislative advocacy and be on the ground in community with our grassroots partners. But most of that happens in person. And our neighbors need to see each other, our friends who we think that we've spoken to people over time when really we're just seeing their Facebook or Instagram posts. We have to balance out our use of technology and understand when it is appropriate to use it to power justice movements, but also understand how over-reliance on it can cause us to limit our critical thinking and also our willingness to band together with our neighbors to fight for the things that are important to us. And I think that was under 2 minutes.
Dr. Williams.
All right. Everything that has been already said. And so I really have enjoyed these recommendations. And so what I am going to do is just make an argument to encourage us to move away from being overly reactionary or based on reaction, and be proactive. So there's and part of the plethora of things that are getting thrown at us is part of the scheme. Right. So you become overwhelmed with the number of things that are, it's almost as if every day there's a new thing. Right. And now we have to respond to that new thing while still having that old thing that happened just minutes ago on our brains as well. So moving away from being overly reactionary to becoming more proactive. And part of that proactiveness, I think, will move us towards humanizing the dehumanized. And there's a series of things that we can do to do that, including the things that people have already said, so I won't repeat that. But I really encourage us to really be proactive and think about the things that we can do instead of being overly upset and stress-induced situations in our own lives in which we're perpetually reacting to everything that comes our way. And in that, there is a need to really humanize, to dehumanize in much of the ways in which my colleagues around the screen has already uttered. So I'm going to keep it right there.
So powerful. I'm going to try my best to close this out. I want to thank each of you who offered such incredible words and encouragement and experiences. Thank you to our panelists for your powerful insights. Thank you to everybody who joined. We had a lot of folks on this call and this conversation. Thank you for leaning into the discussion, everybody with courage and honesty. And I have to thank our CLASP Equity Matters team for organizing this event and bringing us together, including everybody from our communications team and our development team, and certainly our racial equity team. And I want to offer a special thanks to Neo Philanthropy, who actually sponsored this event and who's making today's conversation possible. We started with a message from Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman. She reminded us in that opening message that the very nature of our multiracial democracy is under attack. And so today's conversation has made clear how coordinated these attacks are, how coordinated they are in their design to divide our communities, to weaken long-fought, long-held civil rights protections, and to erode the very infrastructure that allows all of us to participate fully in our democracy and creating and affirming that democracy every day. Little nuggets of the work ahead of us shared in this conversation. And so just a reminder of our homework. We've got to translate the complex harms into really plain evidence that policymakers and community leaders and our neighbors alike can understand what's at stake. We've got to document the harm every day as it unfolds. We're providing real-time insights. We got to equip coalitions across the country, decision makers to fight back. We've got to work with state and local partners. Many of you talked about this. Many of you are organizing coalitions across the country to really do everything we can to lessen that harm, but also ensure that our communities are not losing access to vital supports every day that those harms play out. We've got to, as you said, Dr. Williams, you left us on that be proactive note. We've got to sow seeds for what is to come. We've got to do the hard work to de-silo, to align across all of our sectors, build towards not just responsive, reactive, but transformative policy frameworks that are going to really move us forward and move us forward boldly. And this is our shared homework. So each one of us has a role to play in carrying this work forward. We are amplifying voices of those most impacted. We are bringing policy research and expertise into every debate. We are building cross-sector coalitions that pursue equity-centered solutions. So I leave this as an invitation to everyone. Where do you find yourself in this work? What role, what responsibility can you carry forward with you from today's conversation? My colleagues have put a survey that helps provide us feedback in the chat. Please take a minute and complete that to give us feedback. And I want to encourage you to register for our next Equity Matters conversation. It will be in December 4th, and it will be about philanthropy in the crosshairs, which is a very timely and critical conversation. So thank you again. Together, it is together, right? Together is how we're going to resist harm, strengthen our alignment, build the kind of future of a multiracial democracy where every single one of us has dignity, has voice, has opportunity. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Take good care. Talk to you soon.